not only to secure business continuity, but to foster innovations and enhance resilience across supply chains. Third, help governments and investors prioritize DRR funding and help reach those most at risk from disasters. Fifth, focus more on crisis prevention. Every dollar invested in resilience today saves 4 in future losses. But the climate won't wait around for us to decide. The Asia-Pacific is leading in DRR, but it needs bold financial action. Let's accelerate DRR financing for our future. Invest in resilience, and invest now.
To kick off our session, let me introduce our plenary speakers. First is Honorable Maria Antonia Yulo Loizaga, Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Government of the Philippines.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning again. As the Asia and the Pacific remains the most disaster-prone region in the world, whilst also being the fastest-growing regional economy, investing in resilience is paramount. We host 60% of the 8 billion global population and a rich diversity of ancient cultures and natural resources, as well as traditional scientific and technological knowledge. The advancement of the Asia-Pacific region, despite multiple hazards, represents the triumph of promise over peril. An integrated approach to disaster risk financing that is both data and context-driven is needed to streamline risk prevention strategies across sectors and along different decision-making levels. This will allow us to ensure that we can leverage potential synergies across global financial mechanisms, for example, under the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, and the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as development financing. Data that is used to estimate direct and indirect disaster costs accurately is critical to enable targeted DRR investments and ignite investor interest. Equally important is the sensitivity that we must give to social and cultural contexts as well as scale. The Philippines promotes convergence budgeting in the public sector to overcome fiscal space constraints and leverage synergies among government agencies. As an example, the Environment Ministry is collaborating with the Public Works Ministry on green-gray solutions and multipurpose infrastructure for water supply and flood management. Our National Adaptation Plan identifies the risk that risk-informed infrastructure is needed and is a priority for adaptation, action, and disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk financing from broad sources and different scales, from blended finance models to climate resilience bonds, are needed today. Innovative financial mechanisms and sector-specific risk-sharing instruments are likewise needed. For instance, mobilizing private sector resources for DRR, in particular focusing on integration of disaster risk reduction into core business value cycles and supply chains is critical. Equally important, risk transfer for vulnerable sectors such as agriculture, and care for the MSMEs in our supply chains who compose over 98% of our economy. From a development perspective, the public sector cannot bear the full cost of DRR investments alone. It is only through an all-of-society approach that the right investments in capacity building to continuously address risk, address the intersectionality of social vulnerability, and the fragility of ecosystems, the adoption of appropriate and advanced engineering and technologies, and strategic partnerships across sectors and scales and geography. All of these combined will make us win the race to resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Loizaga. Now please join me in welcoming our second speaker, Honorable Arsenio Balisacan, Secretary of the National Economic Development Authority, Government of the Philippines.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers and guests, good morning. I am deeply honored to speak at the first plenary session of the 2024 Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction and to welcome our international delegates to the Philippines. The Asia-Pacific region has been at the epicenter of global disasters, ranging from typhoons and earthquakes to floods and tsunamis. The disaster's impacts are most acutely felt by economies that are highly vulnerable to shocks. As climate change worsens these threats, it is evident that robust disaster risk management, including adaptive and responsive disaster risk financing, is becoming increasingly important. Without sufficient resources, the path to rehabilitation and recovery lengthens, and socioeconomic consequences are profound. While helpful, traditional models of disaster risk financing, such as grants, loans, and insurance, often fall short in terms of both speed and sufficiency, underscoring the need for more adaptive and responsive solutions. The Asia-Pacific region is at the forefront of developing new innovative financing modalities, such as catastrophe and thematic bonds for projects with tangible social and environmental impacts. For instance, the Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility secures affordable insurance against climate-related risk, while the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company provides immediate liquidity after catastrophic events. The private sector has also adopted a more systematic approach from the traditional corporate social responsibility to actively engaging in risk transfer mechanisms. This expedites economic recovery by swiftly providing funds to help businesses and households recover from disasters. As part of our disaster risk financing strategy in the Philippines, we have established the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund, a dedicated annual budget for disaster response and recovery efforts. Since its inception in 2010, the fund has allocated approximately $3 billion to support these initiatives. Additionally, we have integrated budgetary requirements for mitigation and preparedness into the annual budgets of various agencies and governments. We are also exploring reinsurance options, including creating the private sector-led Philippine Catastrophe Insurance Facility and contingency credit arrangements for future disasters. Limited fiscal space, especially in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, necessitates developing our legal framework for public-private partnerships for the financing of climate-resilient infrastructure. To date, majority of the PPP projects are in sectors of both physical and digital connectivity, demonstrating our priority for connecting leading and lagging regions, promoting greater economic mobility and inclusivity, and reducing the cost of doing business across the archipelago. Major water supply, flood control, and irrigation infrastructure projects are also in the pipeline to meet the economy's growing needs while ensuring climate resiliency and inclusivity. We are happy to note, as the President mentioned this morning, that the Philippines has been selected to host the Lost and Damaged Fund Board. This board provides mechanisms for vulnerable nations to access funds and will help mitigate the effects of climate change. We hope to strengthen global partnerships for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction and management through this initiative. The Asia-Pacific region stands at a critical juncture. We face unprecedented challenges and are also at the forefront of innovation and cooperation. Our region comprises nations with diverse circumstances, risks, needs, and capabilities. However, by drawing on our unique capabilities and harnessing our collective strength, we can work together so that no nation will stand alone in the face of climate adversity. Together, and with much hope and optimism, let us surge to the future as one resilient region. Thank you, and mabuhay.
Thank you, Secretary Balisacan. For our third speaker, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Jaime Augusto Sobel de Ayala, Chairman of Ayala Corporation.
Good morning to everyone. Secretary Tony, Secretary Arce, always a pleasure to share the stage with you. And thank you for this opportunity to speak at this forum as a voice from the private sector. I think today's discussion is a meaningful and important one, considering that the Philippines is among those most at risk from climate change and has limited resources to mitigate, to adapt, and to bounce back from calamities. I have to say that I support the thesis that disaster risk reduction financing presents a significant opportunity to safeguard lives and livelihood. On behalf of the business community, let me state that disaster risk should be incorporated in enterprise risk management and business continuity practices. Further, DRR should be embedded in corporate strategy and the whole capital allocation process. Lastly, we believe that corporate boards should have oversight on their company's DRR and resilience strategy and hence should be constantly trained around this space. All these occur within the backdrop of an upcoming era of greater transparency about corporate sustainability performance, including how companies impact their environment and host communities, and vice versa. Within the next few years, owing to the new sustainability reporting standards by the ISSB, Philippine companies may be required to more clearly disclose their climate-related risks and opportunities and their mitigation and adaptation measures. Companies should now be more rigorous in conducting enterprise risk management exercises. Disclosures may now have to state the specific financial impacts of climate change, considering a whole range of different scenarios. These would also have to be integrated with a business continuity management system to ensure the DRR will be brought to the mainstream. As examples, the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, PDRF, which I'm proud to say I serve as a co-chair, as well as Arise Philippines, the latter through the leadership of Mr. Hansi and the SM Group in the Philippines, have been consistently conducting capacity building sessions on business continuity and community resilience for both private enterprises and public institutions. At Ayala, the company which I chair, we have committed to achieve net zero greenhouse gases by 2050, which will be complemented by a comprehensive climate risk assessment exercise, as well as actionable emissions reduction roadmaps. Interventions and resilience measures developed by private institutions across the different platforms would indeed benefit greatly from DRR financing. Second, risk awareness without the appropriate action is quite insufficient. Disaster risk management initiatives should also be integrated into corporate strategy and company investment plans. Alongside the capital deployment processes of companies, these can all hugely benefit from support provided by DRR financing. Just a couple of examples on resilience investments from our own group here in the Philippines. After Typhoon Haiyan, Globe Telecom, our telecommunications arm, started to invest in more typhoon-resilient cell towers. They've also invested in elevated network equipment and improved equipment covers considering recent volcanic activities. Ayala Land, in turn, our real estate company, continues to incorporate disaster-related data in their estate planning, ensuring our properties are resilient, sustainable, and valuable. On the financing front, our Bank of the Philippine Island provides sustainable finance solutions to large institutional clients and smaller enterprises, alongside advisory services to build organizational resilience. Finally, ASEN, our renewable energy platform, successfully completed pioneering energy transition mechanism transactions. This enables us to retire a fairly young coal-fired power plant by 2040. And ASEN has recently partnered with Singaporean firms to explore the use of transition credits to accelerate the plant's retirement further to 2030. And I think Secretary Balisacan mentioned this as a great pioneering effort. Lastly, I cannot understate the role of company leadership teams in steering enterprises towards greater climate awareness and action. As stewards of their organizations, they are charged with the unenviable task of balancing resilience with their fiduciary duty to their stakeholders and shareholders. Boards and practitioners need to constantly be trained on the latest thinking on climate science, on risk management, and on adaptation. These are just a few thoughts on how we can enhance the practice of DRR in the region. Thank you, and I look forward to the ensuing dialogue that's going to take place. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zobel. And now we will transition to the panel discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Kamal Kishore, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. As our moderator for this session, Mr. Kishore brings a wealth of experience in disaster risk reduction. Please join me in welcoming him to guide our discussion today.
A very good morning to everyone. I think Secretary Loizaga, Secretary Balisacan, and the Chairman of Ayala Corporation have very nicely framed the discussion already. The issue of how do we come up with practical solutions to enhance financing of disaster risk reduction has permeated through the entire opening ceremony this morning, as well as the discussions on the pre-conference day yesterday. And the fact that, the hall is full to discuss a very dry topic of finance means that the time has come to address this in a comprehensive, systematic, and sustainable manner. So very happy to have the opportunity to moderate the discussion this morning. A lot has already been said. I just want to highlight a few additional points. Number one, I want to highlight the scope and magnitude of the problem. Last year, in October, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure released its biennial report, where it assessed the global risk annual average losses, the expected annual average losses to infrastructure systems alone, to something like $800 billion. So that's assessed annual average loss. It's not realized losses. Realized losses, you can see the last few years, it ranges between $200 billion to $400 billion, something like that. That's a significant proportion of the size of the global economy. And if we were to have a situation where probable maximum loss was realized, this could really threaten not just the development prospects, but the whole stability of the financial system. So with that background, I think it's really important that we begin to address this issue in a comprehensive manner. we have to look at national budgets, we have to look at sources of climate finance, we have to look at private finance, we have to look at how we can deploy different and innovative insurance risk transfer mechanisms, and we also have to see what is the place for a new paradigm of overseas development assistance in this whole context. So in this context, as for everything else related to disaster risk reduction, it is really important to highlight that in Asia Pacific, there is a lot of innovation on almost everything, and this area of finance is no exception. We heard from Secretary Balisakan the work that is being done here in the Philippines in terms of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management funding arrangements. We have experience in Indonesia, where we are looking at how we can use the past data of losses to allocate resources to different provinces. Of course, we have the work that has been done in India over the last 4 or 5 years to look at the entire spectrum of disaster risk management needs, not just response, but also risk reduction. So I think it would be important to look at what can we learn from this experience, what is working, what could work better. So I think it's really important to build on the experience that we already have. In this context, I think it's important that while we talk about more money, we also talk about better money, which means money available at the right time, accessed in the right manner. And we also have to have systems to really assess the quality of outcomes. A lot of the times we promote these things as a virtue, but we do not really see how it is applied, how practical projects for disaster risk reduction are developed and implemented, and how it actually leads to results and it affects the lives and livelihoods of people who are at risk. I think with these initial remarks, I have now the pleasure of inviting the panel, which I have the honor of moderating. First of all, I would like to invite His Excellency Masatsugu Asakawa, President of the Asian Development Bank. Sir, can you join us here? His Excellency Hara Hiroaki, Vice Minister for Policy Coordination, Cabinet Office, Government of Japan. Moving over to the Pacific, Her Excellency Kilistina Tuaimiapi, I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm not getting it right, CEO of Finance, Ministry of Finance and National Planning, Tonga. And finally, His Excellency Esala Nayasi, Deputy Secretary General, Strategy, Policy and Programming, Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Good morning, Excellency, President of ADB. ADB has been a front runner in this topic. ADB is Asia Pacific's climate bank. You are at the leading edge of addressing issues related to risk and resilience in the region. Can you give us a perspective from international financial institutions and see how international financial institutions can help mobilize and channel more money for a disaster risk reduction? And to make that happen, what are the kinds of reforms that would be required?
Thank you. Thank you, Kamal. First, let me thank our organizers for bringing us together here on this very important issue. Thank you so much. During my visits to our DMC, developing member countries in the region, I have seen how these disasters and climate shocks impose heavy economic costs and place millions of people at risk. especially women and vulnerable people. International financial institutions like ADB need to step up, really to step up, to help to build resilience. We can do this in several ways. We can, first, enhance financial resources and knowledge for DRR. Second, promote budgetary processes that respond to risk. And third, strengthen the enabling environment for DRR. ADB will continue to support these areas in our work, to be sure. We transformed, as Kamal said, ourselves into the climate bank for Asia and Pacific, scaling up our ambition to provide 100 billion US dollars in cumulative climate financing from 2019 to 2030. Out of this 100 billion US dollars, 34 billion, so one-third, is for climate change adaptation. So not only mitigation, but we invest a lot in adaptation. And disaster risk reduction is, of course, a critical component of this. We also need to support the region's poorest countries with financing in the form of grants money. Our so-called Asian Development Fund, or ADF, serves this purpose. Our recent replenishment, ADF 14, which completed at the time of our annual meeting in Georgia's Tbilisi in May this year, creates a new window of grant financing for DRR and climate change adaptation in the amount of 428 million US dollars. Partnership funding facilities can also provide the incentives to invest in areas such as an early warning systems that are regional and built around shared risks. ADB helps to bring together funds for this. Last Thursday, I approved ADB's Disaster Risk Management Action Plan, covering 2024 up to 2030. That includes an early warning system, a partnership funding facility, as one of our actions to contribute to early warning for all. Last, on the question of key reforms, let me note that IFI provides a substantial amount of so-called budget support for their developing member countries through so-called policy-based loan, PBL, and grants, and associated technical assistance. This support can help governments strengthen that enabling environment for disaster risk reduction. For example, ADB's Pacific Disaster Resilience Program supports policy reforms in participating countries that include quantitative disaster risk assessments, promotion of building codes, and risk-informed land use planning, and disaster risk financing strategies. The program also provides a source of contingent financing for disaster response, recovery, and reconstruction. We have a program like this right here in the Philippines called the Disaster Resilience Improvement Program, or DRIP, totaling $500 million. This is helping to promote the use of disaster risk information in decision-making, budget allocation, and project design. Let me stop here, Kamal.
Thank you very much, President. You made some very interesting remarks. I think you started by saying that we need to reform budgetary processes, the whole innovation of policy-based loans to promote resilience, very interesting. And I would like to congratulate our colleagues at ADB for the approval of their disaster risk management action plans. That gives a basis for countries represented here to cooperate with ADB for the coming years. Now let me turn over to Minister Hiroaki. Minister, Japan is a very disaster-prone country. You have a lot of experience. You are on the leading edge of managing risk in a very effective way. Your achievements are very, very impressive. Some of those I have seen with my own eyes. What is your recent experience as to how we can strengthen government budgets to accelerate disaster risk reduction, given that there are more disasters and more severe disasters happening now.
Thank you, Mr. Kamal. Japan experienced Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011, followed by numbers of flood and other major natural disasters. These events revealed strong needs ever for pre-disaster investment for mitigation. The government of Japan was determined to avoid huge post-disaster budget expenditure and lengthy effort of reconstruction and promote mitigation through National Resilience Plan. The 3-year emergency plan was set out for the period from 2018 to 2020 for investing some 50 billion US dollar. After its successful implementation, a new 5-year plan was developed in 2021, and it is under implementation with a total budget of some 100 billion US dollars. Disaster resilience infrastructure includes seismic reinforcement of public buildings and bridges, renewed of all the water supply lines and emergency power supply for evacuation shelters and hospitals. Besides these structural measures, non-structural measures are ongoing, such as flood hazard mapping, evacuation guide for citizens using mobile application, and land development regulation in high-risk areas. For example, Abukuma River of Fukushima Prefecture underwent extensive reinforcement against flood with the budget of 1 billion US dollar under the 3-year plan, which resulted in no damage from an extremely strong typhoon in 2019. Without these mitigation measures, it is estimated that the financial loss from the typhoon would have been 5.4 times of investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. I mean, obviously, the government of Japan is deeply committed to investing in resilience. $50 billion over a 3-year period is significant investment. And you highlighted specific measures that are being taken. And now, as I was saying in my opening remarks, you've also measured the outcome. You're proving that investing in mitigation helps you save 5.4 times the investment you make in mitigation. With that, now let's move over to the Pacific. And I want to go to Tonga. The memories of what happened in 2022 are still very fresh. The President ADB just now made a case that there should be a national budgeting process for disaster risk reduction. However, in the context of SIDS, where the countries are under a lot of fiscal stress, the issue of financing debt, competing priorities, in such a situation, what do you see is the role of disaster risk assessments to look at what is the impact of disaster risk on the overall fiscal health of the country? And how do we advance the whole notion of embedding investment in risk reduction in the national processes?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. The first part of the question has been asking for the role of disaster risk in fiscal risk assessment. Definitely, from the Tonga's perspective, disaster risk has been played a pivotal role in making sure that we, from the government side, should capture in our physical assessment. With Tonga's case already in a high debt distress, which is more than 50% of its debt, public debt, has been already maxed. So with a situation not only back in 2022 with the volcanic eruptions, but with several hurricanes and typhoons have been happening in Tonga, it's already added on to the distress in Tonga. With Tonga's case, the Kita, the recent hurricanes happened in Tonga, It has been calculated, the total loss and damage that we encountered during this hurricane has been 30% of our GDP, which is compared to the physical situation of Tonga, it's already substantial. But in that case, with the situation in Tonga, if we're not doing something to help to help the country being resilient to any disasters that happens, it will force again the country to be in a more or high distress. With that case, there are some few key considerations that should be taken into account that will help the country alleviate or minimize all those risks. First is like we look at the legal reforms area. We have been doing some reforms which is highly aligned to the budget supports that the government has been benefited from its donor countries. We've been aligned all these legal reforms to make sure that it captures not only other financial risk, but as well as the disaster risk, which is very important and critical for management of its fiscal assessment or fiscal risk of the country. Also, we have been looking at some sort of approach that can be helpful, like the risk, layering of the risk in the country. Because we are thinking if we do that approach, it will help the country identify the different types of, or the different magnitudes that each risk has been affected the country. In that case, it will help the country know or be able to identify the sort of financial assistance that it will better assist us in that case, given the situation of the country itself. Also, add to that is that the priorities in disaster risk. We think that the priority of the disaster risk is best to be country-driven rather than donor-driven, because the country knows it best. And we know how to prioritize all these with the support from donor countries, but the priorities in disaster risk should be country-driven in order to be effective when it's implemented. In addition, the improvement or the strengthening of coordination within government, not only within government, but also with other relevant stakeholders that needs to be, their views, their concerns, their voices, it needs to be factored in order to assist the disaster risk plan or strategy to be more effective, to be implemented. Maybe I'll finish that and I can continue later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important perspectives. Country-driven prioritization of disaster risk reduction measures, coordination not just within the government, but also with other actors, and embedding disaster risk assessment in the fiscal risk assessment of the country. Now let's go to Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, Deputy Secretary, Excellency Asala Nayasi. The countries in the Pacific obviously have unique challenges. We just heard limited fiscal space they have. In such a context, how can we explore the innovative financial instruments to assist the Pacific countries build their resilience, help them invest in disaster risk reduction in a manner which is driven nationally, priorities that are determined nationally, just as we just heard from Tonga, and what are the challenges and opportunities in that regard?
Thank you, moderator. Let me take this time to acknowledge the presence of our ministers and delegations from the Pacific who are here this morning. I believe it is important for me to also underline the context for the Pacific, particularly within the Asia-Pacific context. You've heard from Tonga in relation to what a natural disaster could mean to its own economy. For Fiji, during Tropical Cyclone Winston, Fiji lost 33% of its GDP. For Vanuatu, 64% based on Tropical Cyclone Pam. So for us, in relation to the intensity and the frequency of cyclones and its impact on our economy, it is huge. It also means that for some of our economies, given the frequency of natural disasters, we are in a state of perpetual recovery, which not only affects our own economy, but more so the recovery process in which our countries have to go through, and therefore affecting our own ability to cope and adapt. The second issue that I wish to raise in relation to context is our ability, particularly as smaller economies, to drive economic development in the context of natural disasters. Most of our economies, a good number of our economies, do not have the private sector base that would be able to drive investments in our economies given our smallness in size and the level of vulnerabilities that we have. And as the CEO of Finance of Tonga had also alluded to, our dependency on foreign aid, investments, and donor financing is one that we always rely on in small island countries within the Pacific context. The issue for us now is predictability, the availability, and the scale of financing that can be available to us to be able to cope, not only in terms of investments in our preparedness, but more so in our response to natural disasters. In relation to the response that we have as a region, there are three aspects that I wish to speak on. One is on the policy framework. For us, we have what we call the 2050 strategy, which is a guide for us, which brings together the issue of climate change and DRR in a context that can provide guidance to our countries in the region, and therefore also identifying DRR as a security issue for us through a declaration which we call the BOE Declaration. Recently, as last year, our economic ministers have also adopted what we call the Disaster Resilience Financing Roadmap. That is to provide guidance not only to us as a region, but countries to be able to help them build systems, provide guidance to them in relation to how we can mobilize financing in response to disasters in the region, that is. In relation to the second part on instruments that we have, we've heard today about blue and green bonds. That is also instruments that we have in the region. Fiji is one country that has taken that up, and it is one that we as a region need to explore to be able to bring in private sector investments. The second is also insurance, parametric insurance, whether in response to disasters, but more so also in our climate adaptation efforts, particularly to help small farmers and those that drive our economy on a day-to-day basis. The third area that I also wanted to cover is the facilities that we have as a region, and I refer to the Pacific Resilience Facility. It is one that our leaders have endorsed, one that has been established to be able to address the challenge that we have, particularly in relation to access to finance. I can probably talk about that later, Your Excellency, if I have the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. A lot of interesting initiatives, Pacific financing for disaster risk reduction, roadmap, the work on insurance, looking at other facilities. We'll come back to that in a moment. But let me go back to the ADB president and ask a question which is coming up again and again about the private sector involvement. So how do we facilitate? Everyone says that private sector should invest more in resilience, but how do we make a business case for them? How do we encourage private sector to be a bigger player in investing in disaster risk reduction?
So thank you, Kamal, for that question. Let me start by saying that private sector involvement, mobilizing private sector is extremely important. This is why ADB has made a substantial private sector shift as a part of our corporate strategy recently. Let me also note that the losses in the private sector from disasters can be immense. This includes both direct facility losses and supply chain losses. So we should take a holistic approach that recognizes how the private sector can contribute to disaster risk reduction and also benefit from it. The private sector offers tremendous resources and knowledge that can be harnessed to address disaster risks. To promote this, first, we need reforms in institutional and legal frameworks. These should provide opportunities for bankable investment in disaster risk reduction and for generating stream of income. There needs to be an enhancing framework that supports innovative financial instruments such as parametric insurance, catastrophe bond, and so on. In addition, legislation can create incentives for private entities to invest in their own resilience. For example, by requiring disclosure of disaster risks. We also need to ensure that households and private companies have access to disaster risk information, including information on the benefits of investing in DRR. Second, IFIs like ADB ourselves work with government to create incentives for private investment in DRR, such as tax breaks, subsidies, guarantees, and risk-sharing arrangements. Public-private partnership, PPP, can help to pool resources for DRR and maximize the impact of funding. Let me also encourage the use of risk-based pricing of insurance premiums and financial rewards for resilience and risk reduction. Last, let me highlight the importance of promoting innovation through the private sector. One way ADB is doing this is through investment in companies, including startups, ventures, that can provide tailor-made solutions for disaster preparedness and response that can be scaled up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. I think the whole importance of reform in the institutional and legislative systems to facilitate innovation and encourage private sector to be a bigger player in this space is very well taken. You mentioned public-private partnership. That provides me a nice segue to move on to Minister Hiroaki. Japan has a long tradition of private sector involvement in disaster risk reduction. There is a very vibrant private sector network, Japan Bosai Forum. But specifically in the context of financing disaster risk reduction, what is the Japanese experience of public-private partnership, and what can the world learn from you?
Thank you, Mr. Kamal. It is indeed essential for us to address extreme natural disasters not only by the public sector, but also by seeking partnership with the private sector. In Japan, a number of corporations prepare their own business continuity plans as a part of their efforts of DRR. Also, retail stores and logistic companies are in cooperation agreement with the government for procurement and transportation of relief goods in case of disaster. Also, the government may request large-scale corporate developers to install rainwater reserve facility and emergency stock warehouse in order to ensure preparedness in public places. PFI and PPP have been developed in DRR in recent years, especially for renewal of old infrastructure, the major social issue which encounters Japan now. For example, the public and private sector have 20-year contract for maintenance and renewal of water supply and drainage systems, which leads to cost effectiveness in management of resilient infrastructure. Japan is no exception in seeking innovation in effective use of private capital and partnership in DRR, and would like to learn from good practice worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So, in addition to more traditional ways of engaging private sector in preparedness through pre-arrangement, procurement contracts, availability of water supplies, rainwater storage, etc. I think the work that you're doing with private sector to renew infrastructure systems, make them more resilient is very interesting and worth looking at a bit more closely. Let me now go back to Tonga. In the earlier segment of this discussion, we talked about disaster risk assessments and how those can inform the broader planning, assessing fiscal risk. But such risk assessments require data, and availability of data, data management systems, analytical capability, all of those are in some ways, they are kind of barriers. How can we overcome those in the context of small island developing states?
Thank you very much for the question. Of course, we believe that the challenge of lacking data has to start from the national level. And we rightly believe that in order for the regional and even international organizations to be able to move forward and implement or design any policies that is relevant to any individual countries, national countries or the national level is supposed to support these kind of initiatives. And we rightly mention it because with Tonga's, we approved in 2020 the disaster risk financing strategy, on which it outlines there are 6 principles in which we outline. It's very important. One of those principles, it states in there the issue of data collections, not only data collections, but also data analysis. Of course, analysis will be based on those information available on data collections. And that issue, we have been identified to help us not only in policy designs, but also to make it as evidence-based in all discussions that we make, whether with the NGOs or the CSOs or whoever the sectoral arena in which we engage in disaster risk reduction discussions. We have been putting a principle or a priority in this in our disaster risk financing strategy to make sure that the government is abiding to. Not only that, but we have been, as I alluded to in my previous intervention, we have been aligning it to our budget process through our joint policy metrics for budget supports, interventions or assistance from the donor partners. Because we think if we align it in that way, in that approach, like with the joint policy metrics, it won't be able to happen. But in aligning that, it will give the opportunity for each relevant stakeholders to make sure that they will comply with it. And it's part of the legal reform that we also make under our PFM systems. We try to make sure that all these stakeholders have been complied with all these, which is if they don't, it needs a role of mutual finance to make sure that we follow up with all these stakeholders. Not only that, but I'd want to acknowledge here the support that made by UNDP in funding mutual finance and relevant ministries in doing budget takings. In budget takings, there are 2 major areas that we do budget takings here. Is number 1, gender, and number 2 is climate change, which also capture disaster risk reduction. Because we think that with this support, we're able to get real-time data when we do the budget takings. Because previously, we did not realize that some of our assistance to relevant stakeholders is already there, and the finance is already there. But with the doing of this budget taking, we are able to identify what exactly goes to disaster risk financing. And that's a program or a project that we continue on to do. And we have been rolling it out to also the NGO and CSOs for them to assist them in identifying all these areas. And it's very important here to mention that not only disaster risk financing through climate change, but the impact that we identified of the disasters in the in gender, whether it's men or the females or youth or the young ones, but we have been identified in several categories. This impact has been identified very detailed, which is a very important and very critical project. And this is one of an approach that we wanted to move forward to, and we also seek other assistance from other bilateral and multilateral partners to continue supporting these areas in which it's very important. Because, and rightly saying that not only within that help the policy design, but it also help us with our assessment in physical area of the country, because we will be able to make a better costing of what has been, of the impact of disaster risk in the whole government. Maybe I will leave there.
Thank you very much for that response, particularly your emphasis on setting up national level systems with rigor, budget tagging to look at how money is going to different aspects of building resilience is very key. With that, now let me go back to the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum. In the earlier segment, you talked about the Pacific Resilience Facility. So what do you see is the role of Pacific Resilience Facility in mobilizing international finance for disaster risk reduction efforts in the Pacific region?
Thank you. As I've said earlier, there is a clear recognition in the region on the issue of access to finance, whether it's climate change or even DRR. So our leaders, in their wisdom, they've now established the Pacific Resilience Facility. It addresses three key issues. One, the mobilization of financing, and also the ability for us to be able to access it readily and within not only our governments, but also our communities. Second, it is a facility that serves projects or community projects, that is, those that probably the IFIs will not be able to reach, particularly in the way that their modus operandi within the region. Third, there's recognition that also there's a plethora of financing institutions, international and also the regional level, that also work or provide financing, particularly in the area of resilience. This particular facility is one that does not duplicate that, but it only complements it and ensures that it reaches those particular communities for which other regional and international institutions do not normally reach. In relation to the core functions of the facility, it basically invests grants. So we're in a pledging state at the moment. So invest grants. From those investments, it generates income, and it is the income that we use for projects in the region that are accessible to communities. There are two windows that the facility is set up to provide assistance for. The first is on climate and resilience grant, and the second is on social and community resilience grant. As I've said, it is, we are at a phase now of doing pledging. We are hoping that we will be able to fundraise 500 million US within the immediate phase, and following which we will then target 1.5 billion based on the leader's decision in Tonga this year. So as we speak, there's been a number of countries that have pledged to help finance. We have Australia, we have Saudi Arabia, the US, UK, and also the People's Republic of China. And we are looking for opportunities for financing and also opportunities for partnerships with our partners, including ADB, Japan, and others who are trusted and reliable partners in the region.
Thank you very much for sharing that, and I wish you all the best on making this work in the way you are imagining it. Really impressive and detailed thinking on how this could serve the communities in the Pacific Island countries. This has been a wonderful, extremely rich discussion. We heard the point of national ownership, nationally driven prioritization emphasized again and again. We heard about the need for institutional and legislative reform to facilitate private sector participation. We heard how we need to systematize data. We have to have better tagging in our budgets to track how we are spending on disaster risk reduction and resilience. We also heard how we can generate stronger evidence base. As we heard from Japan, as to if you invest in disaster risk reduction, what is the kind of loss you avert, and hence, what is the gain of investing in resilience. With that, before I conclude this session, I just wanted to say that this is a conversation which we need to carry forward. We are at a very opportune time having this conversation when next month the COP in Baku, finance is one of the major emphasis areas in Baku. Next year, in Spain, we will have Financing for Development Conference, which will look at a whole range of issues around financing development. And we must ensure that discussion on financing disaster risk reduction is embedded in that larger discussion. So we look forward to working with you from the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction side and the UN system side. We are engaging in that process. There is going to be a PrepCom for the Financing for Development in the first week of December in New York. We will take the messages from here to that PrepCom. We also hope to organize a global policy forum sometime in February to go deeper into this and inform the wider discussion on financing for development. So as I said at the beginning, given the kind of participation we are seeing in this topic today, this is an idea whose time has come. Let's get this done. Thank you very much.